Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be chairing this panel. My name is Ritter, as you can see. I'm from the university that's 5 miles down the canal. And I have to mention to our American colleagues that that's a World Heritage Site, the canal, that is, not the university. This is a tri-national conference. Canada and the United States, Canada and Cuba, although there are not many Cubans here. Canada and the United States, of course, are best friends for many reasons, personal interaction, shared values, but also because we have to be. Canada and Cuba are very good friends. And since 1959, we have observed the diplomatic rupture, the embargo, and so on with great concern. And we would like nothing better than to have the relations between the two countries be normalized. With respect to the forthcoming summit, I had thought that there was a major conundrum, a major dilemma facing Canada, because as you know, Canadians, the Canadian Foreign Affairs Office was instrumental in promoting the democracy charter in the OAS. And that would seem to be in contradiction to inviting Cuba to participate or to become a member of the OAS. But maybe my view of that is wrong, at least that it's been cast into doubt by the discussions this morning. The question in my mind had been, should Canada support Cuba's participation in the OAS, sort of in violation of the democracy charter as we understand the concept of democracy, or should our interest in promoting Cuba's reincorporation into international institutions and normalization with the United States, should that take priority? So we have two speakers who will explore and resolve this issue in the next few minutes. And I'm very happy to introduce Stephen Baranyi, who has been a principal organizer of this policy dialogue. He's a professor at this university, has had a major career in the North-South Institute in Ottawa before leaving for academia. Robert Fox of Oxfam has had a major role concerning Cuba, mainly because Oxfam Canada has been responsible for Oxfam World's relationships with Cuba, and Robert Fox has managed that since 1992. So let me turn this over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Arch. Can everybody hear me? Is this mic working? Great. Okay. So during the first panel, obviously, we heard some very interesting hints about how Canada might help finesse the differences over Cuba's possible participation in the next Americas Summit. I will come back to those ideas, and I'll suggest some additional options for Canada in the second part of my remarks. But before that, I'd like to flesh out what our chair has already hinted at, this issue of the conundrum for Canada and indeed for other parties presented by Cuba's possible participation. I'm drawing on my views, but also the views of other colleagues in the Latin America Study Group of the Canadian International Council, and I'll focus really on the constraints that Ottawa faces on this file. The Latin America Study Group includes some former Canadian ambassadors to the OAS and other very senior former senior OAS officials, as well as academics such as Professor Ritter and myself. So we do not speak on behalf of the Government of Canada at all, but our reflections may, I hope, provide some insights into and perhaps even some insights for the thinking in Ottawa, at Foreign Affairs, and in other places on these issues. So officials who are present today, who do represent the Government of Canada, should of course feel free to clarify, correct, or elaborate later on. First, it is true that Canada has in the past played important bridge building roles in the Americas. Ottawa contributed to the Contadora and Esquipulas peace processes during the difficult years of the Reagan administration in the 1980s. It contributed greatly to UN and indeed OAS good offices, and then to peacekeeping in Central America during the 1990s. In 2009-2010, Canada actively participated in the search for a diplomatic solution to the coup in Honduras. So Canada clearly does have the capacity for third-party activism when it has the will to play that role. But it does not, as some people hinted earlier on, particularly embrace the idea of playing an activist bridge-building role between Washington and Cuba, and partly because both sides have pretty clearly indicated over the decades that actually they prefer to speak to each other directly on these issues. Thanks, but no thanks. So Ottawa is careful. Secondly, as noted by the chair, from the moment Canada joined the OAS in 1989, then hosted the Americas Summit in Quebec and played a key role in negotiating the Inter-American Democratic Charter, all the way to the Harper government's current Americas strategy, Canada has made the protection and the promotion of democracy a cornerstone of its hemispheric engagement. Canada played a key role in drafting the Democracy Clause of the Quebec Declaration, which states, and I quote, "Any unconstitutional alteration or interruption of the democratic order in a state of the hemisphere constitutes an insurmountable obstacle to the participation of that state's government in the summits of the Americas process," end quote. So while Ottawa has indeed maintained a respectful or correcto relationship with Havana since 1959, it definitely sees the Cuban regime as not meeting the standards of liberal democracy codified in the Democratic Charter. And on that basis, Ottawa does not, I think, particularly favor moves that might lower the bar on liberal democracy in the region, at the summit, or in other inter-American fora. Yet, like the US, Canada doesn't wish to be left out in the cold on this. We're used to the cold, but this is one cold spot we don't really want to be in, especially if Washington decides to go along, perhaps quietly, with the majority Latin American and Caribbean view on Cuba's participation in the next summit. The inter-American system, with the OAS at its core, remains very important to Ottawa because those are the only hemispheric institutions which include Canada as a full member, unlike CELAC or sub-regional bodies. Saving the Americas Summit is therefore part of safeguarding Canada's presence in the hemisphere. The tricky part, of course, is finding a way to both save the summit and enabling Cuba to participate on the one hand without, however, compromising the principles of the Charter that are quite dear to Canadians, not just to this government. So let me end then with some thoughts on how Canada might contribute to that outcome, and I'm really speaking on my own as a prof here at Ottawa University rather than a representative of others. So first, I think that Canada could view Cuba's participation in the Americas Summit as a confidence-building measure rather than as an automatic dilution of inter-American democratic norms. Cuba's participation in the Panama Summit would certainly move it further along that pathway, that roadmap opened up in San Pedro Sula in 2009, but it would not nullify the need for many other steps to be taken by Havana and by others, before Cuba could become a full member of the inter-American system. There's no automatic fast track here, just like accession to the European Union system. As such, for Canada, it seems there would probably be little cost and certainly potential benefits for allowing Cuba's participation in the Panama Summit to go ahead. So again, this is a variant on the concept of seeing Cuba's engagement in the Panama Summit as an opportunity, as Professor Leogrand mentioned, rather than as an inevitable, insurmountable problem, impasse, dolor de cabeza, etc. Okay. Secondly, as other panelists noted, Ottawa could quietly support the construction of an agenda for the summit that would keep Cuba from becoming the central issue. That might coalesce around a major challenge, common challenge for the hemisphere, such as the improved management, cooperative management of migratory flows, which is something actually all of us face, including Cuba, including the United States, including Canada, etc., etc. Ottawa might also support a lower profile discussion, perhaps at the working level, on ways of breathing life into the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The conferences and the publications that were generated around the 10th anniversary of the Charter in 2011, I went back to those, and they provide a goldmine of ideas and rich debate on possibilities for reviving the Charter, which, let's remember, has lost some, if you will, impetus and credibility, not vis-a-vis Cuba, or not because of a lot of other things that have happened and not happened in the past decade in the hemisphere. So going back to that work, including the work of Canadian scholars such as Max Cameron at UBC and Tom Legler, who's now in Mexico, can give us, I think, many ideas for how that regime, the inter-American democracy regime, could be revived, strengthened, how particularly its application could be strengthened. So ideas like a compendium of best practices in this area, the creation of a voluntary peer review mechanism, the establishment of a special rapporteur on democracy, etc. Now, these are not Cuba-specific, they are broad, and that is, again, a multilateral way of dealing with particularly country challenges, particular country challenges. And ironically, I think if presented the right way, and if not blown through a bullhorn, condemning Cuba's particular record, this conversation might actually interest Cuba and some of its allies if it includes a serious consideration of how the participatory and substantive dimensions of democracy in their countries, such as they are, could be recognized and in fact could be enhanced as a complement, as a necessary, I would argue, complement to the mostly liberal, procedural dimensions of democracy codified in the Charter. Now, this is obviously very complex. It will take time, and much, much longer than the months leading up to the Panama Summit. It will require adaptation on the Cuban side, but also a fair amount of conceptual and operational innovation on the OAS side, by which I don't just mean the Secretariat, but also other member states, current member states, active member states. Now, I can hear some of my CIC Latin America Studies Group colleagues saying, oh, great idea, but this current government in Ottawa is never going to go for that. Well, gentlemen, let me quote the words of Foreign Minister Baird at the OAS General Assembly in Asunción just a few months ago. He noted there that democracy, and I quote him, is a journey, not a destination. There is no single outcome. Every democracy will look a little different, coming from a different set of experiences and from a different journey. Foreign Minister Baird. Now, more recently in Singapore, just a few weeks ago, talking to an Asian audience, Mr. Baird noted the difficulties of democratic reforms in countries like Myanmar and Vietnam, but he added emphatically, and I quote again, "We need to understand that democratic development takes time. Cultivating a culture of democracy involves entire societies, the old and the young, the rich and the poor." These phrases could be cited in briefing books by officials, for the minister, for others, to remind them of a slightly different framing of the issues than the default mode that some of us sometimes go back to when talking about Cuba in particular. This recognition of the different and always very difficult paths to democracy, including, and never unfinished paths to democracy, including in our own society, may provide an opening for productive dialogue, even among ideological foes, on ways of assisting Cuba in its construction of more democratic institutions. I think this could be particularly timely now in Ottawa, given the creation of an integrated Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, which merges the democracy promotion, development, and indeed other mandates of different units into one department, with hopefully some money to back that up. Finally, and probably also quietly, since Ottawa has, I think, learned, perhaps in a difficult way, with China, with Cuba, with others, that megaphone diplomacy does not particularly work very well on this file, Canada should continue supporting homegrown democratic development through technical cooperation with Cuban institutions, for example, by supporting greater citizen participation in municipal governance, by funding Cuban civil society organizations, quasi-civil society organizations. We can have a discussion about this. Working to enhance tolerance and the peaceful management of disputes inside Cuba, and those exist. They're doing good work. They need support. Or by supporting Cuban policy researchers working on ways of promoting more government accountability and judicial independence. And that work is happening in Cuba right now. It also requires support. I imagine that Robert Fox will elaborate and comment on how Oxfam and other Canadian NGOs are already engaged in such initiatives, and I certainly look forward to further discussion about how they can be expanded, extended in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
So unlike Stephen, I don't think I have to remind anyone in this room that I do not speak on behalf of the Canadian government. Oxfam, as many of you know, is a global movement for change committed to supporting the power of people against poverty and injustice. As Arch mentioned, we have had a program in Cuba since 1993. There are a couple of people in this room who are actually intellectual authors and creators of that program, so I'm very pleased that they're here today. In Cuba, as in all over the world, Oxfam is grappling with issues of power and how those people use their power or abuse their power, and how those with relatively less power have opportunities to recognize that power, grow that power, share that power. We work in the real world in complex places. And so, in the last year, I visited Oxfam programs and partners in countries where where the leaders of women's rights organizations are regularly receiving death threats in this hemisphere, where there are our offices and the offices of our partners are visited by secret police and secret security offices, where there are countries where everything we do and everything our partners do is illegal, because it is illegal to work on human rights issues in those countries if more than 10% of your income comes from a foreign source. So in that context, globally in which we work, then we recognize that Cuba is a complex context in which to work, but by far the least complex. And while there are constraints on what we do, we are not paralyzed by those constraints. On the contrary, there's lots of room for us to do important work and to collaborate with other organizations and other people who are doing important work in that country, in transforming that country and supporting actors within that country who are creating the country that they aspire to live in. We work in, I'm going to talk about sort of 3 particular initiatives we are working on in Cuba that I think are emblematic of the struggles, the process, the efforts at the community level and by sectors that percolate up, because of course democracy is not something that is determined by legislation or by structures or by declarations. It is something that people live and breathe and create every day in their practice. One of the initiatives we have in the eastern part of the country, I think everyone recognizes the poor part of the country, centered around Jesus Menendez with the support in the last number of years of the Canadian government and other actors, has been a process of supporting local decision making and local decision makers in identifying priorities for that community and responding to the priorities of that community. And I think that you will recognize that any decentralizing phenomenon is a democratizing phenomenon, right? When people within a community have the opportunity to identify what their assets are, what their strengths are, what their priorities are, and what their strategy is to build on those assets and strengths in order to meet their needs, then that actually creates space for dialogue, debate, dissent, decision-making at a local level. And of course, in Cuba, where historically you had ministries and you had structures that tended to be national and tended to be vertical, and most decisions were made in Havana, then you had a phenomenon whereby within a community, the people who worked for the Ministry of Agriculture in that community related to someone in Havana, and the people who worked in the Ministry of Education worked related to someone in Havana, and the person in health related to someone in Havana, but they had never actually talked to each other, much less with the local authorities or the local farmers organization or the local chapter of the National Women's Federation or the municipal authorities necessarily. And so creating an opportunity for a conversation and a group reflection within the community whereby all those actors within the community were coming together to talk about, as I say, their work, their challenges, their aspirations, and how they were going to meet the needs and priorities of the people who lived within their community, is a transformative process for them. Complicated by real life, because we started this initiative just before 3 hurricanes hit that part of the island. And of course, a hurricane, any crisis, is a situation where, in any country, you then move back to rather centralized decision making, right? You don't ration from the periphery, you ration from the center. So if there's 100,000 houses or 500,000 houses in the country that have lost their roofs, it's not someone in each community who decides how much roofing material you're going to have. It's someone actually at head office who decides where things get distributed across the country, right? So in that Cuban dynamic, there were very, very important advances made. There were setbacks, but it has been, over the last 5 years and beyond, a process whereby now people in meeting with that community, they talk about themselves as actors, as decision makers. They have a sophisticated, nuanced critique of their history and their past and patterns of behavior they see elsewhere in the country, and a new pride and confidence that they're doing different things and they're doing things differently. And a lot of interest at the national level where TV crews are coming to Jesus Menendez to document the experience of that community and disseminate that experience across the country. So that's one experience. We also work with the agricultural sector, with the National Farmers Union and with organizations that are seen as, in other countries they would be expressions of civil society. In Cuba, that's a more complex dynamic where they are very much aligned to the party and very much connected in complex ways to ministries and manifestations of the state, but are increasingly playing the role of, again, a gremio, of a guild, of an organization representing its membership. And in that, we've been working with them in creating second-tier cooperatives and third-tier cooperatives, supporting their efforts to democratize the economy, right? In a country where there's a long history of cooperativism, but not with the same culture or experience of many countries where people came together individually through their spontaneous choice to create a co-op and organize themselves to meet their needs, but rather very much more an expression of central planning, central thinking about how we organize agricultural production. And cooperatives who received all of their inputs from the state and delivered all of their production to the state. And so we're working with them in creating unions of cooperatives so that they are coming together collectively to purchase their inputs, to access capital, investments, credits, and to collectively market their produce to the hotels on the island, to the citizens on the island, and ostensibly and eventually to the world. In doing that, fundamentally shifts their relationship to the state, and their role as an actor within the economy. They're going down, and we're facilitating that sort of interchange with co-ops in Paraguay to look at their experience. A country that has a very strong cooperative sector at the local level, at the second tier, at the third tier, that's integrated within global supply chains in supplying justly sourced, fairly traded produce into premium markets in Europe, in North America, and other parts of the world, and where the Cubans go there not to lecture, but to learn, which is an important shift in terms of the historic relationship of too much of Cubans' engagement, right? So we act there, as we do in so many spaces, as a broker, as a convener, as a convoker of people with different experiences, different skills, different perspectives, different values, to come together around a shared project and learn from each other, and in that then create, again, the capacity for farmers and the communities that they comprise and that they support to be independent actors, increasingly independent actors, in what is, again, admittedly, a very complex dynamic. Those of you who've been to Cuba, as you know, they don't talk about reforms. They talk about perfeccionando la revolución cubana, no? And so there's a space that they're negotiating within, but they're ever more bold in negotiating that space. And part of our role is, to introduce them to people who, among other things, are giving talks on consumers. These sort of wacky, quirky things of like what people buy and why they buy them and how much they'll pay for them, and what that means then in terms of what you're producing, how you're producing, when you're producing, and how nice the sticker is on the product when you've produced it, which is ideas of materialism and consumerism in one sense to a country that has been, free of much of that, yet is also part of the nature of a democratized economy. And the experience within the economy, of course, extends to other spheres of people's lives. Another area of our work is with an organization that a number of you will know, Cinesex. It is the National Institute on Sexuality, and working with that organization on issues of gender-based violence, an issue that was largely not talked about in Cuba because El Hombre Nuevo doesn't do those sorts of things. And so, again, creating space for debate, for reflection, for challenge, for action on gendered relations, and unpacking within that then the issue of power, not from a class perspective only, but race, gender, education, access, status, and through that window then supporting their work as well with the LGBTI community, and seeing how in doing that you create constituencies whereby that organization, which is related in ways to the state that I'll come back to further elaborate on, actually, though, represents the interests of a group of Cubans who are seen as a minority, who are seen as a group with a particular issues, challenges being recognized, that their rights are acknowledged, respected, and supported within the formal state structures. Now, the head of Cinesex actually happens to be Mariela Castro Espín, the daughter of the current president of Cuba. And so she also, in addition to being the director of the center, is a member of the People's Assembly. And a couple of months ago, in the People's Assembly, voted against the Labor Code, because the Labor Code did not have sufficiently clear and articulate language protecting gender identity as a named grounds for discrimination in the Cuban Labor Code. Now, there are many countries on this planet where the struggle for gender identity in the Labor Code is not yet fought and won. Cuba is one of those countries where it is not yet fought and won, but it is fought. And when it came forward before the Assembly, she voted against that piece of legislation. And it is believed to have been the first time in the history of Cuba that there's been a no vote in the Assembly. And so again, that is a little bit of a window into, as I say, this idea of a constituency, this idea of civil society being organized, active, engaged, and an elected representative feeling that she has a responsibility to the constituency that she represents. A constituency that we often don't talk about, that isn't in the majority, but is what, at the basis of human rights, is what human rights are about. It's about the minority, it's about the vulnerable, it's about the marginalized, it's about the discriminated, it's against the criminalized, right? And so, another instance of the work that we're doing as an actor within civil society, supporting actors within civil society, some of whom may be very closely aligned with the ideology of the state, the values of the state, and of the Cuban Revolution, and yet find themselves negotiating that space, immersed in the graves in which we were all immersed, to stand up for rights, to recognize the need for change, to recognize the need for citizens to build on their strengths and exercise their judgment in our collective best interests to meet our collective objectives and goals. So in all of that then, as we're looking at symmetry and as we're looking at these bilateral relations between states and multilateral relations among them, it's critically important that we not lose sight of the role of civil society as a convener, as a broker, as an innovator, as a boundary pusher, as someone who challenges power, speaks truth to power, and creates the conditions that in the end sustain the democracy that we aspire to. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm tremendously impressed. You made that eloquent presentation with no notes in front of you. That's amazing. I couldn't do that. Questions from the floor? Professor MacDonald.
Thanks very much. Those were great presentations. I just wanted to ask Stephen or Robert if you have any thoughts on it, on another issue that was pointed out in the last summit that divided Canada and the U.S. from the rest of the hemisphere's positions, apart from Cuba, which was approach to the issue of drug trafficking. So I'm just wondering if you perceive that as a real obstacle towards improving Canada's relations with other countries in the hemisphere, given that our government has taken a strong prohibitionist approach to drug issues. And in fact, we might be left behind by American administrations where we see more movement at the subnational level in the U.S. towards opening up other approaches to controlling drug trade. So I'm just wondering if that is indeed an important issue, or is Cuba really the most important issue, or is there other work to be done on other types of issues? And secondly, I wanted to ask Stephen, you said that Canada sort of stayed out because we were told by both sides, Cuba and U.S., that they don't really want to talk to other parties, they want to talk directly to each other. But the earlier presentations suggested that's not working, and maybe there is now more openness towards dialogue with other actors. So do you think that is a real shift that Canada should be cognizant of? And then it seems to me, well, we're not going to be able to do this on our own. We have to work with other partners in the Americas. We can't come in and lecture on our own. So what would be a strategy around that we could work with other partners like Mexico or Colombia to open up this kind of dialogue that was discussed earlier? Thanks.
Thank you. Could we take two more questions and then have a round of answers? Other comments or questions?
Hi. My question is this one. Do you think that this concept of liberal democracy that Canada and United States use, it will make some Latin American countries reject that position in the summit? Because if we remember, the democratic charter doesn't work in some situations. Honduras coup d'etat, Venezuela coup d'etat. Maybe for that reason, Latin American countries were looking for another solutions like the UNASUR Compromiso con la Democracia or Protocolo de Ushuaia. So this role of Canada to promote the liberal democracy in these summits and try to build a bridge between Cuba, United States, and the rest of the country will work or not?
An additional question?
That was Ambassador had a question.
Eric. Professor Hershberg? Whoops.
Well, thank you both. Very interesting, Stephen, your comment about the work that Cameron was doing. Several years ago, and you probably know this, he led what was called the Andean Democracy Research Network, jointly between the University of British Columbia and the Carter Center. And it was specifically developed in hopes of informing the OAS as to how to approach the Inter-American Democratic Charter at a moment when clearly there was a great deal of contestation in the region about what the elements of democracy ought to be, and trying to figure out ways in which there could be, signaling systems, early warning systems for democratic backsliding, where there could also be processes, as you mentioned, of self-evaluation, where there could also be ways of incorporating recognition of different kinds of democratic advances in this very uneven and heterogeneous kind of landscape that you described. And this was submitted to Secretary General Insulza, who wrote a very eloquent introduction to the book that came out of that. I have the sense that it then wasn't particularly followed up on, and clearly these have been a difficult several years for the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And I would be interested in a sense of those of you who know the OAS better than I do, of whether there may be prospects for exercises such as that, in which I think Canada could be very well situated to contribute, to help the OAS to move in a more productive, convergent direction in terms of how it approaches the Democratic Charter.
Thank you very much. Stephen, would you like to begin?
Okay. Let me be telegraphic, since we're, I think, running out of time, or tight on time. Laura, on the issue of different positions with regards to how to manage international, transnational drug trade and its derivative activities. I don't follow this anymore. I used to be the focus of my work too long ago, but I sense that although our focus has been on the Cuba issue here, that the other issue remains as divisive, if not more, and I don't know quite the balance there, in the hemisphere. and that Canada does risk being left out in the cold on this one too. I don't know, perhaps we'll hear a bit more from others who actually work on this file in the hemisphere or in Ottawa to see whether there's any movement on that. Any possible movement on that could position Canada a little bit more favorably on that issue. So back to Cuba though, and Inter-American Democracy Charter. Completely agreed that there was this flurry of work around, particularly around 2011, the 10th anniversary, before, after, and so on. Great prefaces were written, good discussions, and so on. And then it sort of stayed there. And so that's one of the reasons why I thought this would be a good point in time to suggest that we go back to some of those discussions and some of those products and some of those people, those individuals, from Mr. Insouza himself to scholars who are working on these questions, to see what can be, whether again the summit and subsequent processes present opportunities to return to the question of reviving, enhancing the application of the Charter, and in fact reviving, breathing fresh life into the Charter. Whether, what the space is for that in the OAS, Secretariat, and member states, I think Ambassador Ramdin, perhaps Ambassador Cullum might be in a better place than I am to comment on that. So let me end by bridging to Anna's very good question about this tension between liberal democratic or procedure institution-focused free and fair elections-centered conceptions of democracy versus more substantive, participatory, diversity appreciating conceptions of democracy. There's, again, this is a conundrum. There is, I think, legitimate fear in some quarters and some capitals, including Washington, including Ottawa, that reopening the Charter itself, particularly on the question of broader conceptions of democracy, will inevitably lead to a lowering of the bar, a dilution of what the normative gains that have been made, and so on and so forth. So I'd certainly agree with Max Cameron, who argues we don't need to reopen the whole Charter. What is perhaps being suggested is discussion on a protocol, an additional instrument, if you will, in due course, but certainly not next year, but just having the discussion, a more constructive discussion about different models of democracy that didn't exist out there, except for really Cuba, in 2000, when the Charter was adopted, but do exist now in the hemisphere. There's a huge diversity, right? So recognizing that not just Cuba, many countries in the hemisphere, not just Venezuela, but Brazil, also value participation, social and economic inclusion, and inclusion of citizens in deliberative processes that can lead to redistributive policies that will be more socially. This is not pie in the sky. This is actually reality for just so many, not just governments, but peoples in the hemisphere and so on. And so, again, I'm not sure that that's what Foreign Minister Baird has been alluding to. But I'm intrigued by the opening. I'm intrigued, and I think there may be just enough of a crack in the the edifice of liberal orthodoxy, small L, obviously, liberal orthodoxy in Ottawa, to at least want to partake in that discussion in a more constructive way. The flip side is that, to me, this is the only avenue through which to engage Cuban authorities, such as they are, and Venezuelan authorities, such as they are, and certain other governments in a serious discussion of democracy. Just sticking to liberal orthodoxy is a non-starter.
Well, before delving into sort of what I think Latins are thinking Canada's role should play, I think it's important to say that my impression is that for most Latins, we are missing in action. We're not seen as sustained enough in our attention. So they acknowledge that we play a role, but in a lot of the conversations I have with Latin Americans around these sorts of issues, they don't feel that Canada is engaged enough within the region, particularly on any issue other than extractives, that we are having a real influence, that we are an actor that they should engage with, and in part that's because, as I say, there's an intermittentness to this. There's pressures on D8D in terms of its presence and its resources at this time, and its ability to be as engaged and as present as it might have been in another moment. In part because it is being encouraged to have sort of a very focused brief, and so much of its attentions is directed that way. So there are countries where our ambassador is referred to as the Minister of Mines, and that has an influence in terms of our perception and the role we're playing and the legitimacy we're seen to have on some issues. But I also think that, to speak specifically to the point you raised, Laura, around the drug trade, we're seen as like, the rest of the world has moved on and we're still back on that, beating that drum. But I again apply that more broadly. Within Oxfam, when we talk globally about innovation and change and important currents of new initiative that we need to understand better, a lot of that discussion is focused on Latin America, particularly on South America. But in Canada, you don't feel that in the conversations. You don't feel that the Canadian government's really looking at the approaches of governments in Latin America and independent initiatives, regional initiatives, new thinking on the environment, new thinking on social democracy, the world sees that as a laboratory where important innovation and experimentation is happening. And I don't feel that we have our finger on that pulse, and that we are engaging with the excitement that the region feels themselves about this treacherous ground that they're traversing, right? But there's an exhilaration there that if we felt a little more of that, we might have more incidents in some other discussions we're trying to have with them, I suspect.
Thank you very much. Are there additional urgent questions? We're running over time, but any final questions that emerge from the floor? George Jacoby.
Appreciate the very carefully phrased assessment of as to whether Canada could play a role in this, and it seems that notwithstanding the speeches of Mr. Baird, we can probably expect a harder line approach on Cuba along the lines of the drug trade, and reflective also of another important issue in inter-American affairs, the Falklands Consensus that was reached within the inter-American community, which Canada, I guess, went back on to some extent. We had the Argentinian charge as part of our tennis group for about 5 years complaining about this, so I'm acquainted. But in the hopes of actually realizing some, do you think that you could develop a strategy and would to convince the government to be more open on this issue, to realize their stated goals of improved human rights in Cuba as a way of, reinvigorating the charter and also encouraging some compromise on Cuban participation, while holding Mr. Baird to his statements on democracy, that it is an evolving thing. I mean, do you think you could develop within the academic community, within the study group, a sustained dialogue with the government to try and convince them to move forward on this? What are your chances?
George, thank you so much for that question, dear colleague. Well, look, this is not university professors don't normally develop strategies for advocacy, right? But many of us worn many hats over the years, and so it's certainly a challenge that I would welcome, taking on with others in this room. What our chances are, I'm not sure yet, because we haven't actually heard much from our government officials. But after the lunch that's coming up in a 45 minutes or so, perhaps we'll have a better sense of what the chances are, not really for us persuading them, but for perhaps a slightly different, fresh framing, more constructive framing of the issue and of Canada's options to actually emerge within different parts of government itself, which we can, perhaps contribute modestly to, but fundamentally, I think it has to, as you know very well, come from other places, including from our like-minded partners, allies elsewhere in the hemisphere. Right? So more on that behind closed doors in a few minutes, since we're running short on time. And perhaps more on that in the blog space in weeks to follow. So watch Eric Center's blog, watch our blog at SIPS, and other spaces for this discussion to continue.
Well, thank you very much to everybody here and to our two excellent speakers and their presentations. Thank you.
Really just, we had on the program that Stephen and I would say some closing remarks. The closing remarks I would make are simply to thank you all for coming and to thank the panelists for joining this discussion. I found it very interesting, and it's provided food for continuing thought. I think Stephen's right. I'm hoping that we can use our respective blogs to start some conversations or continue conversations about these themes, and I'm very interested in feedback as we do so. So really my closing remarks are just a thanks to all of you, to the University of Ottawa, and I look forward to continuing discussions around these issues. Stephen.
Sure. Right. I think I'll just speak from here, if I may. So, yes, I had a list of take-homes, substantive issues that I've been accumulating throughout this fascinating discussion. But I think I will save those for lunch and blogs afterwards. And just thank you all for coming. Thank Eric and your team at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies for approaching us, for having the confidence to ask us to partner with you on this interesting initiative. I hope that it's the first of several discussions we can participate in and contribute to on this issue over the next few months and beyond, definitely. Thanks to the panelists. All the panelists particularly came from Washington and elsewhere to again, share your experience, your insights, your research, your suggestions, very polite suggestions, very Canadian-like suggestions for the Canadian government, very fascinating. So thank you, for all of that. A lot of food for thought, thank you to SIPS, the University of Ottawa, for helping us organize and put on this event. Thank you to CIC, the Latin America Study Group, and other parts of the Canadian International Council for also contributing a lot along the way. And I take George's question as an implicit offer to continue discussing and possibly acting on these issues in a constructive manner over the months and years to come. So thank you, everybody, Arch, and to be continued.